Morning. How are you? Yeah? Good. It is really, really good to see you all this morning. If we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Michael. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's a joy and honor. And I say this every week, and I mean it every week. It is a joy and an honor to get to be with you this morning as we open up God's Word together to be more molded and made into the image of Jesus alongside one another. Happy Father's Day, as we've said to all my dads out there. Really, really grateful for you. This Father's Day has honestly gotten me thinking a lot about my own dad. I love my dad. A whole lot, to be honest. He is one of the kindest and most generous humans that I think I have ever met in my entire life. And as I look back on being his kid, now that I have kids of my own, to be quite honest with you, my appreciation for who he is and what he has done for me and my entire family, it has only grown throughout the years. That wasn't always the case, right? And I imagine for many of you, that's probably true of you and your dad as well. For example, I can remember when I was younger, I really believe, for me, when I was younger, my dad, he was just like this. He was like this superhero, right? Like I firmly believe there was nothing that he couldn't do. Like he could open every jar in the house. He could throw a baseball a mile, or at least what I thought was a mile, right? He seemed to have an answer to every single question I could possibly think to ask him. So it was like, Dad, how many miles is it to the moon? And he'd be like, oh, son, it's like 1,000,000. And of course, to my little brain, it was like, well, that seems right. Dad, you know everything. From my perspective, from my little eyes, he was the smartest. He was the strongest. He was the most awesome human being to ever live. And then I became a teenager, right? And it was almost like overnight, he went from super awesome hero to super embarrassing villain. Like he just seemed so out of touch to me, just like he didn't know how it really was out here. And that if I were honest, that he was just sort of bent on ruining or spoiling all of my fun. I mean, didn't he know I had a reputation to protect? Like, how could he keep me from these things that I wanted to do? And who listens to the Beach Boys? I mean, it's not 1970 anymore, what are we even doing? And all of that to say that wonder that I once had for him, it faded. It faded over time. Now, to be fair, it came back, right? Albeit it came back a little bit differently. Once I got out into the real world with a real job and a real family of my own, I actually realized just how much of a superhero he always was, right? But there was this season, and maybe you've been there with your dad too, where that wonder that I had for him just sort of wandered away, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think that's something that happens in a lot of relationships, especially the ones that are the closest and most intimate to us, like the relationship between a parent and a child. And part of why I bring that up this morning is just like that can happen with our earthly fathers, that thing can happen with our heavenly Father as well. Like, have you ever found yourself in that place with God, where the thought of him maybe doesn't feel all that amazing to you anymore? Maybe where you take him for granted just a little bit, that who he is and what he's done is just a bit normal and commonplace to you. Maybe in your worst moments, he even starts to feel like the bad guy in your story, though maybe you would never say it that explicitly. Maybe you've been there. Maybe some of you are there this morning. And today, what I want to try to do is help us a bit with that, to help us recapture or rediscover a bit of that wonder of our Heavenly Father. So we're going to look at a famous passage of Scripture this morning. It's one that you've probably heard or maybe even read many times, and it comes from Luke chapter 15. Sometimes you'll hear it called the parable of the prodigal son, or perhaps the parable of the two sons, since there are lessons that we can learn from both kids in the story. But today, I want to invite us to read it with a little bit of a different lens, to not look at it as the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the older son, but instead to see it as the parable of the wonderful Father. That's the lens we're going to read it through today. So let's jump in. We're going to pick up in Luke chapter 15. I'm going to start in verse 1 just to kind of set the context for us a bit, and then we'll jump down to verse 11. But this is what's going on. This is in the ministry of Jesus, and it reads starting in verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So I just want to draw our attention here real quickly to point out the context that you have two different groups of people in Jesus' audience at the moment. You have tax collectors and sinners and scribes and Pharisees, people who were considered irreligious and immoral, who would have at the very least been seen or thought of themselves as sort of an outcast from God and society, who likely even saw themselves and their relationship with God in this way. And then on the other hand, you have people who were very religious and very moral, who also had their own ways of thinking about God and how he related specifically to them. Two groups who, for the most part, thought they knew what God was like, how he felt about them, and why he felt that way. And part of what Jesus is attempting to do in this teaching is to blow those preconceived notions that they have about who God is out of the proverbial water. For both groups to hear this and go, hold up, God is like what? What is God actually like? And so he tells them a trilogy of parables, and we're going to look at the last one. So let's jump down to verse 11. This is what it reads. It says, "And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living." He was the quintessential wild child, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's his lifestyle. Verse 14, "And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything." So, as sin tends to do, it started out well for this younger son. It started out as a good time. But as we see, what happens is in the end, it left him alone, empty, and needy. Maybe you also know that feeling, just to speak to you for a moment. Maybe you also know that feeling of rock bottom. Maybe you've been there, where your sin has taken you to places that you never imagined you would go, right? Addiction, maybe to drugs or alcohol or porn. Sexual sin that's led you through such a string of relationships that you don't even feel like you know the person who looks back at you from the mirror anymore. Maybe you've lost your job or your marriage or your family or something else, and you feel like you're just in this spot where you have to pick up the broken pieces of the mess you've made of your life. That's where this guy is at too. Verse 17. "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him," which basically means begged him to come in and join the party. But he answered his father, Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." The older brother is indignant, right? Because he hasn't done what the younger brother did. He's been the good one, the one who did what he was supposed to do. And he can't believe that his father would respond to his younger sibling this way. I think it's worth noting that despite their behavior, the two brothers actually have a lot in common in this story. You notice they are both actually out of the house, aren't they? Neither one of them is in the house. One is in a foreign country and the other is out in a field, but neither one of them is where you would expect to find a son. They both look at their dad, essentially, in this story as a means to an end, right? One through reckless abandonment and one through his moral living. But both have this posture that they are doing what they are doing because they want the dad's stuff. They don't want the Father, they want his things. And this isn't the point of the sermon, but remember who's in the audience, right? Remember who Jesus is talking to here. He's trying to tell us that there are actually two ways for us to reject God. One by blatantly rejecting him and chasing sin, and the other by trying to put God into our debt through our good, moral, or religious behavior. Sound familiar? But both don't actually want the Father for who he is. They just express it in two different ways. And as we'll see, Jesus is saying is that that's not how anything actually works with God. And that is incredibly good news. Verse 31. And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." Now, throughout history, a lot of ink has been spilled unpacking all that we can glean from this parable. But in light of it, the question that I want to put in front of us this morning is, when you think about God, what comes to your mind? When you think about who God is, what pops into your mind? Like, what do you think he is really like? And what do you think he thinks about you? And not the you that you wish you were or that you that you present to other people, but the real you. You know, the one that you really know on the inside, the real you. Like, this is a bit reductionistic, but when you imagine God, is he sort of like that just supportive buddy who doesn't really care how you live and just wants to encourage and support you and help you accomplish your dreams? Or maybe you imagine him as distant or detached or maybe even unfeeling. How do you think he really feels about you? How does he feel about you? Like, really? And listen, I know, like of course you'd say he loves you. He's God, right? Like, that's kind of his MO. He's supposed to love you, right? But how do you think he really and truly feels about you, about who you are? Like, when he watches you living your life, what kind of emotional response do you think wells up in him? Is he a little disappointed? Is he angry? Is he proud? Is he empathetic? Is he a little bit frustrated? Pastor and author A.W. Tozer once famously said that what comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And I think he's right. Because how we answer that question, it determines so much about our lives. It determines how we live. It determines what we do. It determines how we approach God or how we feel like we're supposed to approach God. It determines how we pray. It determines how we think about ourselves. And subsequently, it will determine our joy or our anxiety and all sorts of other things. And what I want to help you see this morning is that through this parable, Jesus is telling us this is what God is really like. This is who he really is. And so what does he show us? I got a few things for us. First and foremost, I think the most obvious thing that we see from God in this story is that God is extravagantly loving and gracious. I think it is the most predominant characteristic that pops from these pages. So most of the time, people point to the Father's reconciliation with the Son as the primary example of his love and grace. And to be sure, it is that. But the Father's gracious love can actually be seen all the way through the entire thing. So for example, if you go back to the beginning in verse 12, Jesus says, "And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.'" Now, when the original hearers would have heard this, they would have been absolutely astounded at this request. For the first century world, this was not a shocking thing to do, but it was an incredibly offensive thing to do. So to give you some perspective, in the first century world, if you had two sons, when you died, the estate would be divided and split between the two of them, usually with 2/3 going to the elder and 1/3 to the younger. But all of that happened when the father died, not beforehand. So when this son comes to the father to ask for his inheritance, do you see what he's doing? When this son comes and asks for his share now, do you see what he's actually saying? He's saying to his father, who is still alive, "I wish you were dead. In fact, you are as good as dead to me now anyway. So give me what's coming to me." As I said a moment ago, what the younger son is saying is, "I want your stuff, but I don't want you. I want what you're supposed to give me, but I don't want to have anything to do with who you are. Their relationship was just a means to an end for him, and he's tired of it. So he wants to cash in now. And upon hearing that, I imagine it makes you feel a degree of how Jesus' audience would have felt too. That somebody needs to tell that boy to sit down and shut up, right? Like, I don't know about you, but for where I'm from, that's butt-cutting language, if you know what I mean, right? Like, that's what's going on here. And that would have been the same in their culture as well. And in their culture, the traditional Middle Eastern father could only respond in one way. Give him nothing and drive him out. Give him nothing and get him out of the house with verbal, if not physical, blows. But what is fascinating is that is not at all how the father responds, is it? That is not at all what the father does. And if Jesus' audience would have been shocked by the son's request in the first part of the verse, they would have been utterly beside themselves in the second part. Jesus says he divided his property between them. The father does it. The father honors the request. It's interesting because the Greek word for property there is literally the word bios, as in biology or life. The son is asking the father to essentially tear his life apart, to tear his wealth apart, his livelihood, his standing in the community, to basically tear himself apart. And the father does it. The father does it. The audience would have never seen a father respond to an insult like this. They would have seen it as wrong, as scandalous even. And even though we're a bit removed, I think we get this too, because what the father is doing is he's enduring the worst thing I think a human being can endure. Rejected love, right? I mean, let's have a human moment, okay? Let's have a human moment together for just a bit. I don't want us to breeze by this. Rejected love is always the most painful thing for us, isn't it? Like if you put your heart out there for someone and they reject you, you almost reflexively have to turn them into the bad guy, right? They almost immediately have to become the villain in your story. You have to harden your heart towards them because you've got to protect yourself. You got to shield yourself from that pain. So when this happens to us, we get mad or we retaliate or we reject in return. We do everything possible to diminish our affection for that person so that we won't hurt so much. But this father maintains his love for the son, even under these circumstances. He endures the agony of this request and still gives to and blesses the son. And if that weren't enough, then when the son returns, the father completely and totally welcomes him back. Jesus says he put a ring on his hand and a robe on his back and sandals on his feet. This is another thing that doesn't always hit our modern ears, but this is a way of showing that the father is restoring to him his identity, his dignity, and his authority as a son. The robe would have been one of the fathers. It was his way of saying, you are mine. You belong here. You are a part of this family. You are my son. Sandals likewise were for sons. It was distinguished clothing. Slaves were the ones who went barefoot. And the father is saying, you are no slave here. And the ring would have been the family signet, like what people would use in other times to like sign official documents and things like that. It was a sign and seal of the family's authority. The father is saying, this is yours now. All that is mine has now been returned to you. Point being, the son comes back and the father completely and abundantly restores him. He doesn't just meet his request, but he goes above and beyond. And what I need you to understand is that no one in their right mind would think the father is doing the right thing here, okay? No one in their right mind would think that. All conventional wisdom would say, this is wrong. This is too much. This is inappropriate. This is why it incenses the older brother and would have incensed the Pharisees too. They would be thinking, how can God be like this? How can God respond this way to the undeserving? Does he not know? Does he not know what they've done? Does he not know where he's been? Does he not care? And yes, God certainly cares about sin. He hates it. He absolutely hates it. It's what keeps us from him. And he has just and righteous wrath for it. That's a part of why Jesus died, so that God might take what we deserve onto himself. But the point is that is not God's first or even most instinctive response towards you. His first and most instinctive response is extravagant love and grace. And that's Jesus' point, that when it comes to who the Father is scandalously gracious towards you. He is scandalously gracious towards you. We said the name of the parable is often called the parable of the prodigal son. It might even be titled that way in the Bible that you're looking at. But this week I looked up what that word prodigal actually means. I always thought it meant like wayward or rebellious or disobedient, something like that. But that's not actually what it means. Prodigal means to spend money or resources freely or recklessly, to be wastefully extravagant, or to have something or give something on a lavish scale. It's the opposite, basically, of being thrifty or frugal. And certainly the younger brother was reckless and wasteful, but he wasn't wastefully extravagant. He was just an idiot, right? The only one here who could be called wastefully extravagant, the only one who gives anything to dare I say, a lavish or reckless extent, is the Father. When it comes to his love and grace, the Father is the real prodigal here. That's what's going on. And the reason I want you to see every little crook and cranny of where that pops up in this parable is because Jesus wants you to know that this is who God is for you too. This is who he intends to be for you. That no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what you've been through or what's been done to you, the Father's posture towards you is one of extravagant love and grace. Here's the thing about grace. Grace is getting more than you deserve. In fact, grace is getting what you don't deserve. Grace is love that seeks you out when you have nothing, absolutely nothing to give in return. Grace is love coming at you that has nothing to do with you. Grace is being loved when you are unlovable. And that's the beautiful thing about the grace of the Father, is that this is the love that he has towards you. This is how he feels towards you. You can't make God love you. That's the point. You can't make God love you. God loves you because he loves you. God loves you because of who he is and what he's done for you through Jesus. His love is not based on what you do or what you don't do, but it's based on who he is. And the father's words to the older brother are meant to remind us of this. He says, son, this is how I am towards you too. All I have is yours. I don't love you because of what you've done for me. I don't love you for what you do. I love you because I love you. I love you, and all that I have is yours, and it will always be yours because you are mine. And if there's anything I'd want you to hear this morning, it's that when it comes to God, two things. Number one, you cannot earn his love. And in fact, trying to do that would be the most exhausting and miserable way to live possible. You cannot earn his love. But secondly, you also cannot out-sin his grace. You can't do it because this is who he is. And listen, I know all the things. I know all the things that you may think hearing that. Oh, well, Bailey, you just don't know. You just don't know the mess that I've made. You don't know what I've done. You don't know how far things have gone for me. You don't know all the details. And if you did, I'm sure you wouldn't say that. And you know what? You're right. I don't. I don't know where you've been. I don't know what you've done. I don't know all the details. But what I do know is what God has done. And what God has done is given himself for you through Jesus. He literally let his life be torn apart on the cross to save you, to pay what your sin owed by dying on the cross and then defeating its power over you forever through his victorious resurrection. And if you would come to him, if you would trust him, if you would turn from your sin, as well as all of your religious attempts to save yourself, he has promised to forgive you. He has promised to make you something completely and totally new. He has promised to rid you of your shame, whatever that is hanging around in the back of your mind. And just like the son in this parable, he has promised to clothe you with a new identity and dignity and authority that are yours as his child in Christ. That's what he promised for you, because that's who he is. This is the wonderful news of the gospel. And Jesus tells us that this is who God is, but that's not all. Jesus also shows us that God is profoundly joyful when it comes to you. He is profoundly joyful. I imagine many of us would expect the father to be happy, sure, when the son returns, but also expect the son to kind of make it up to him a bit, right? I mean, he's cost him a lot. And who knows if the son will run off again? I mean, he's done it once. Like, how can we trust him if he's going to not do it again? We might expect the father to be cautious or to be measured or to make sure that the younger son means it, right? But that's not what we see from the father in this story. Instead, the father is just quite simply overjoyed to have the son home. I love this little glimpse we get of the younger brother in verse 17. It says, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. He's preparing this little speech to give to the father, hoping that the father will listen to his words. You ever done that? You ever been in that spot where you know you've screwed something up and owe an apology, and you sort of plan it all out in your head beforehand, thinking through each word and how you're going to say it, the way you're going to say it to communicate maximum remorse, and you rehearse it maybe a few times, preparing for how they're going to look at you when you apologize and what they might say in response. That's what the younger brother is doing here. And the reason I love this is because Jesus tells us exactly what the son intended to say, and then shows us that the father doesn't even let him get those words out of his mouth. It's in verse 21, and the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Stop. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The father just completely cuts him off in excitement, almost like he's ignoring the speech altogether to say, look, forget all of that. It's time to party because you're home. And just before that, in verse 20, it says that the father actually runs out to him to meet him when he's on his way. He runs out to him to embrace him and kiss him. This is another one of those things that gets lost in translation between our world and theirs. Culturally speaking then, running was not something that older men did. Running was for boys, not grown men. Men were supposed to be dignified. To run would have meant the father had to hoist up the fringes of his robe in order to run with speed. And I know we don't wear robes, so imagine what you would have to do in order to sprint in a dress, right? It ain't flattering at all. But Jesus says this is how the father responds to the returning son. Point being, in all of this, when God sees you coming, he gets lift up his robe and run to you happy. That's how he feels. He is unconcerned with your well thought out apologies, but just ready to party and celebrate over you because he loves you. And I have to ask, is that what comes to your mind when you think about God? Is that the image that pops into your mind when you think about how he thinks and feels towards you? Because this is who he is. In my experience, we tend to have a habit of believing that God mostly just tolerates us, right? That he mostly just kind of puts up with us. He loves us, sure, but he's a bit dissatisfied. As if he sits in heaven and thinks, okay, I'm going to show you grace, but man, do you still struggle this way? Are you still this big of a mess? Do you still not have your act together? How long is it going to take? How long is it going to take? I mean, I'm patient, but I don't know if I'm that patient. We kind of think this is the way he feels about us. But let the listener understand, this is not God's posture. It's not. And you got to let this answer the question for how God feels about you. This is how he feels about you. God's posture towards you in Christ is one of delight. It is one of celebration. If you are in Christ, then the words that God spoke over Jesus at his baptism are the same words that he speaks over you in yours. That this is my son, or this is my daughter in whom I am well pleased. He does not define you by your past or your current failure or your latest screw up. He is not cautious or measured in his dealings with you. But because of the atoning work of Jesus, he rejoices in, he delights over, and celebrates who you are in him. To say it a bit differently, you make God smile. You make him smile. He loves you. He delights in you. And I can't help but think there are some of us in here this morning who need to hear that, who need to know that this is how God feels about you. Because you constantly feel like you're living under the weight of his disappointment. You feel like you just aren't enough or can't be enough. Who honestly are a bit like the older brother in this story where you're working, right? You're trying so hard to do all the right things to earn the party from the Father, to earn his smile, to earn his pleasure, to earn his joy. And to you, I would say the same words that the Father says to the elder brother, son or daughter, you are always with me. And all that I have is yours. It's yours. You've already got it. As the scriptures say, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God in him, that we might become all that pleases, all that delights, all that brings joy to the heart of God in Jesus. This is part of what Jesus has accomplished for you. He has made you the apple of God's eye. And some of you need to hear that this morning. Stop trying to work for what you've already got. Stop trying to work for what you've already got and enjoy the joy that God already has for you. Which brings me to the last thing, and this is where we'll land. I think we also see that not only is the Father extravagantly loving and scandalously gracious and profoundly joyful, but when it comes to you, he is also remarkably hopeful. He's remarkably hopeful. Again, in verse 20, Jesus says, but while he was still a long way off, his Father saw him. Have you ever thought about how the Father comes by the chance to see the Son? I think the answer is pretty self-evident or pretty simple. He must have been looking for him. He must have been looking for him. He was out there searching for the lost son. He was out there looking for the lost to come home. He never gave up hope that the lost son would one day be found. His love for his son would never let him give up. It would never let him throw in the towel that the son was just too far gone or had gotten too messy. The Father looked out with hope to find him, and he did. I think we also see this posture with the older brother too. The Father goes out to the older brother to do what? To beg him to come in, to seek him to come in. He's hopeful that the older brother will also come to the party, that he won't stay outside, stuck in his pride, stuck in his indignation, that he wasn't treated fairly or the same, but would see the grace and joy of his Father and come in and partake. Point being, he is looking for the lost because he is hopeful for their return. And you'll notice this parable doesn't really have a conclusion, does it? We don't know what the older brother does, or even what happens to the younger brother. And I think there's a bit of a purpose in that, because I think Jesus intends for this to be an invitation to us all. That Jesus intends for this parable to invite us in, to be a reminder to those who are hearing it, that God is looking for them too. He is looking for them too, and an invitation for them to come home, to know this love and joy and grace of their Heavenly Father. And all I want you to hear today on this Father's Day is that that invitation is for you today too. It's for each and every one of us today too. He wants you to know that God loves you. And no matter the mess that you have made, no matter how you've taken him for granted, no matter how you've rejected him, or even just however you've lost that wonder for him that you first had, he is looking for you to come home. He is hopeful that you will come home. And his invitation would be my invitation for you this morning too. That wherever you are in your relationship with the Father today, whether you're a younger brother or an older brother or somewhere in between, and whether it's for the first time or the 1,000th time, to know you are invited to come home, to be forgiven, to be made new, to be put back where you belong, because of what Jesus has done for you. And it's an invitation to know that every time you think about your Heavenly Father, to know that this is who he is, a God of extravagant love and scandalous grace, profound joy, and remarkable hope towards you, such that every time we utter the words Heavenly Father, they might be the two most wonderful words you ever speak. So happy Father's Day. This is who he is.